Welcome back. The Global Tailings Management Institute was launched earlier this week. The institution will be tasked to improve safety in mine tailing facilities across the world. It will be supported by, among other stakeholders, the International Council on Mining and Metals and the United Nations Environment Programme. Tailing is important in mining projects for safe water and dust management. Now, joining us is Rohitesh Dhawan, who's the president of the International Council on Mining and Metals, and Adam Matthews, who's the investment officer at the Church of England Pensions Board. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'd like to start with you, Rohitesh. Some might say finally, and better late than never, at the inception of this global independent institution. When one thinks of all the damage that is caused, tell us a little bit more about the reasoning behind its creation.
Masa, the reasoning is very simple, which is to make sure that tailings dams, many of whom exist in South Africa, are managed as safely as possible so that people and the communities around those dams are kept safe from any form of harm. In 2020, ICMM, together with PRI and the United Nations Environment Programme, developed a global industry standard on tailings management for how these dams should be managed responsibly. And this institute will now oversee the implementation of that standard and make sure that companies that are adopting that standard, of which every ICMM member has committed to doing, are doing so in a way that upholds the integrity of that standard. So it really is an important part of making sure that these large facilities that are tailings dams are managed very safely.
Yeah, and Adam, just coming in there, if you could just remind and take our viewers through some of the effects, the environmental effects of these tailing dams as well.
Well, I'm actually joining you from Brumadinho in Brazil, and I'm currently visiting the site where there was a disaster in 2019 that led to the deaths of 272 people. I've just been visiting the tailings dam that collapsed that day, and the anniversary 6 years since that disaster is tomorrow, where the community is unveiling the memorial. And it's very evident the human impact, the lives lost, the legacy in the community here, the emotional legacy, as well as the environmental impact. But I think the important thing is that this doesn't happen again. And what you had following that disaster was industry coming together with investors, coming together with the UN and many other stakeholders to really try and work out what are the steps that need to be taken to ensure that we don't see such disasters happening again. A key step was really sort of understanding the risks that they were posed by tailings facilities, the impacts that they can have on communities, and ensuring that really there was clarification of what good practice looks like. And that was the establishment of the global standard. And now, this week, we've been able to put the next piece of the jigsaw puzzle in place, which is ensuring that there's an independent, multi-stakeholder governed institute that can really oversee the rigorous adoption of that standard, so that wherever companies are operating, that there's a way in which you can ensure that they're doing it to the best practice, and that you really are going to ensure that we're in a better place and that you don't see this kind of disaster again occurring. There's still a way to go. I can't pretend that this is going to happen overnight. These are large structures, huge engineered structures. They can have very devastating consequences when they go wrong, but it is possible to manage this well, and this institute is going to be pivotal to that, and absolutely delighted it's going to be in South Africa.
Delighted that it's going to be in South Africa too, and just wanted to know, it's still a long way to go as well, as you're mentioning, Adam. How big of a task is this going to be to implement and oversee these standards and norms?
Well, you've already seen a lot of the largest companies, in particular members from ICMM, ROSE members, that have committed to adopt the standard. They made that commitment when they committed to the process of developing the standard. You've seen the first disclosures on their highest risk classification facilities last year, but we're now really wanting to see the rest of the industry taking this up and it being applied to all tailings facilities wherever they exist. And so there is a long journey to go. We, as investors, are invested in the mining sector. We've been talking to companies, both the large, the medium, the small, to ensure that they're committed to implementing the standard. One of the things many, particularly the smaller and medium operators, are wanting is the guidance on how to do it well. Can they learn the lessons from those companies that have gone first in terms of implementing it? And so we've been engaging those companies. About 68% of the market that's publicly traded has now committed to adopt this standard, and the Institute will really support the rollout, the wider adoption. And confidently expect that in the not too distant future, there'll be few companies that are not operating to the standard, being supported by the Institute, and really seeing this as a market norm and expectation from investors, from banks, from insurers, and government regulators as well.
Now, Rohitesh, as the president of the International Council on Mining and Metals, just listening to Andrew just talking about turning this into a market norm as well, I asked him how big of a task this would be. As the president of that institute, how do you feel about this? Do you think it will be that big of a task as well? And how long, if we could give time frames as well?
Masa, so the way to think about this is that the members of ICMM represent 1/3 of the global mining industry. We are 24 companies and we are the largest in the sector. But there are an estimated 25,000 mining companies globally that operate in the region of 30,000 mine sites. So although we've made excellent progress so far and the members of ICMM are fully committed to adopting the standard and implementing it to its fullest extent, we need to be clear-eyed that there is a very large portion of this industry that today may not be operating to the same standard and will need support, including pressure from investors, including the work of governments, in order to be able to conform to that standard. Because only when a significant portion, or ideally all of those 25,000 mining companies operate to the standard, can we be confident that these facilities are being managed as safely as possible.
And Rohitesh, as we know, sometimes change is a little bit slow. Now, for your members, they've obviously welcomed this. But for the members who aren't, the non-members as well, those companies who aren't a part of your institute, how do you convince them? Because you're saying they're going to be needing more support. But if they say, look, we don't want to abide by these industry norms and standards, are there any repercussions for that?
Well, Masa, we really do hope that for companies that choose not to adopt the standard and to follow good practice, that the people that buy from them or the people that invest in those companies, or indeed the regulators in the countries in which they operate, are not going to support those companies. Because frankly, if mining cannot be done safely, it should not be done at all. And this cannot be an optional requirement where some companies are allowed to get away with lower standards when the leaders of the industry have clearly committed to showing what a good practice looks like. And so we certainly will be advocating to our peers in the sector to embrace this. And we can show very clearly that doing it is in their own interest. It's in good business sense to do this, because it means that you get the support of investors, you get the support of people that buy your product, and you get the support of local communities. And that's fundamental to running a mining operation. But if after that people choose not to embrace this standard, then we do call upon investors in the sector, we call upon customers who buy metal and governments to be able to say to those companies that they will not get their support if they don't adopt these standards.
Just before I let you go, Adam, quickly, are there countries that are high on the agenda that you need to be focusing on that have a higher chance of, the tragedy that we saw happening in 2019 in Brazil?
Well, to be honest, I think wherever there are tailing facilities, it's really ensuring that they're all operating to the best standard. And I think as an investor, and many investors, many of my peers, we invest internationally, and really wherever a company is operating, we want to see them operating to that best standard so that they're not differentiating. And so really working with governments, with industry, with all the stakeholders that really want to see this issue well managed, we're really driving a process here to get to that point. And of course, there's variations in areas where the regulation isn't as strong, where there isn't necessarily the capacities in the government. But if you're a company with tailings facilities, you know now what good practice looks like. You know now that there's an institute that will support you and give you the technical guidance in terms of how to do it. There's the independence of auditors that have the capacities, and there really is no excuse not to be doing this. And I think increasingly it'll become very difficult for those companies that don't adopt the standard, don't work towards it. I think you'll see increasing pressure from regulators. I've been visiting here with the state prosecutors and the important role that they play in terms of overseeing companies adopting these standards and practices. And I think you'll see that really flow through the rest of the world. So of course, there's variations in different jurisdictions, but ultimately there's a very clear message from investors, from the wider finance community, that there is a real expectation. Companies need to walk this path. It's difficult. That's why there's also an institute to support point where there's zero harm to people, zero harm and impact on the environment. And I think that's possible.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and just explaining this new institute to us. That was Adam Matthews, who is the officer at the Church of England Pensions Board, as well as Rohitesh Dhawan, who is the president of the International Council on Mining and Metals.